Well, hello, and welcome to the second of the lectures for the course on the making of the Chinese Buddhist canon. Happy to have you all still here. Today, we're going to deal with the second phase of translations that were made from Sanskrit into Chinese that were going to make up a large segment of the canon as it was developing in China. Last time we talked about how the Central Asian monks, Parthians, and the Kushan monks made their way to the capital of the Han Dynasty. And there they set up a translation bureau. And that translation bureau allowed them to create a whole new form of literature, which was Buddhist texts in Chinese, unlike anything that had existed before. So now we're going to look to see a little bit about what happened when those kind of texts started to be produced in China. The Buddhist tradition, as it met the Chinese culture, was just that, a meeting of a culture. China had a long and sophisticated philosophical culture. And therefore, the fact that Buddhism came into China meant that it didn't come into an empty space. It came into a very busy space, a very busy space. And in particular, they had the literature of the Tao, as we refer to it, the Way. They had the material from Confucius. And now they were adding the material from the Buddha from India. So Buddhism had to find a place for itself. And it had to take into account that the documents and the teachings from the Tao and the Confucian tradition were present in China, and they had to be dealt with. So the early Buddhists believed that one of the ways in which they could do this was to take vocabulary from these materials. In some cases, there is the thought that they tried to match a Sanskrit term with an already existing philosophical concept, either from those who studied the Tao or those who studied Confucius tradition. But as we know from translations into English, equivalents are not necessarily your exact equivalent. We call them equivalents. They're just as close as we can come. That's about all you can say for the equivalents. So Buddhism now is operating in this environment, which is unlike anything it's had to face, except in India, where the Buddhists had to come to grips with the fact that there was a rich religious and philosophical tradition that already existed before Buddhism came along. But once they moved into Central Asia, then they were not being so challenged by these long and sophisticated traditions. The study of the what we call the Tao. And the word Taoism is used as if it has a distinct meaning. But it's just a word which is used the way. It's a word that's used to cover a whole range of Chinese philosophical and moral and ethical and physical and spiritual traditions. One of the things that the Tao people look back to is who they call their founder, Lao Tzu. And you'll see that I give you the names as much as possible in both the older form of transliterating into English sounds, as well as the newer way of the pinyin. So we prefer to now begin to use the new way because that's what China uses. And the older way, though, is what the literature is full of. So you have to know both ways of pronunciation sometimes in order to make the best use of the material that you will see. Lao Tzu is, as you can imagine, a very controversial issue. Was there such a person? Or is it that this Lao Tzu is simply a representation of all of an older tradition of teachings about the world and about the way, which were collected and attributed to a person? It's very hard to make a case either way. But it's for our purposes for the moment, let's assume that these accumulated teachings, whether they came from just one person or from many, is not so much the issue as the fact that they were prevalent and they were being circulated in China at the time when the Buddhist canonic material began to arrive. There were many things in Lao Tzu that you could attribute to pretty close equivalents to things that were being said in Buddhism. Lao Tzu pointed out kind of paradoxical thinking. The softest things in the world, he said, or they said, overcome the hardest things in the world. And they used the example of water. Water is totally unresisting in a way. Water always gives way to whatever it comes up against. So it makes ripples, it makes waves. And yet, when water comes in contact with a stone, while you might say, well, the stone is stronger than the water, over time, water will overcome even a stone and dissolve it. So the ancient Tao's teachers said, the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing. So being soft in one sense, yielding, giving way, turns out to be a really powerful statement. And that's why they finally said the most powerful statement is no action. When water is completely, its course is completely determined by the stones, the water is taking no action. It's just allowing itself to be moved the way the stones are placed. And yet at the same time, as they said, the stones are being slowly overcome by it. So we have all these sorts of paradoxical teachings that point to a way of living which is not totally determined by effort, that the way of nature is such that we are under its domain. And even if the way of nature is very soft, it ultimately wins. Another of the great teachers of the past was in our anglicized way is called Mencius. You see the Chinese pronunciation of the two characters that make up his name. Hunza was a really interesting teacher, and much of what he taught, I think we see had an influence on Buddhism without question. That basically he believed human nature is good. That human nature is like water. Water always seeks to go down to the lowest ground. And he believed that human nature was always like water. It was trying to go to its most basic element, which was goodness. And therefore, he said, the way of learning is not other than finding the lost mind. We need to find that essential goodness which is within us. Now, through the years, philosophers have argued, is human nature essentially, are we essentially good? Or are we essentially evil? Religions take one side or the other. For Mengzi, it was, we are essentially good. I think you see this later in the Buddhist texts of China, where the idea is that everyone has Buddha nature. I mean, that's not too far from the old teaching. Everybody's got it. We just need to find it. So Buddhism was faced with these teachers who were teaching at a very high level, a very intense and demanding level of understanding of human nature. What is human nature? What are we like as humans? And so the early Buddhist texts were at times trying to copy them, and at other times to introduce a whole new genre of thought and literature, the Buddhist canon, into China. One big document which people have used, have been attributed back to Lao Tzu, is the Tao Te Ching. It's 81 poems about virtue and about the way, the Tao, the way things are. And it's a fantastic document. There was no possible way, I think, that the Buddhist texts could have come into China without taking into account the Tao Te Ching. The Chinese knew it, and the verses were repeated on the streets, and people used it in everyday language. So as Buddhism came in, as a strange and peculiar thing in a way, because remember that one of the shocks for the Chinese was the fact that these barbarians and the Buddhists who first came were called barbarians. And the Chinese always said of barbarians, because it was true for everyone who surrounded them up to the time of the coming of Buddhism, none of them had reading and writing. Barbarians didn't know how to read and write. So they had to adopt Chinese as their written language because they didn't have one, and it's true for their surrounding neighbors often. Look at Korea. It had no written form for its language. It had to take Chinese characters for a long time. The Japanese did the same. But here came a tradition out of the desert. Barbarians dressed in peculiar fashion. Barbarians who seemed to violate filial piety by shaving their heads, cutting off the hair which is given to you by your parents. These barbarians who came, of all things, had reading and writing. And it wasn't anything like Chinese. Chinese would say about the text that these barbarians brought with them, it looks like chickens have scratched on paper with their claws dipped in ink. And it's so amazing that these barbarians can look at that strange mass of scratches and make sense of it. So China was faced with this shock that barbarians were literate. So a lot of them said, how in the world did these barbarians get to be so smart? How could they do that? And one of the ways was somebody said, you know, we have the story of Lao Tzu, that Lao Tzu headed off to the West and, in a sense, disappeared. So where did he go? When we look at this Buddhist material and the thought that is behind it, we can say, we now know where Lao Tzu went. He went to India. And when he got there, he was so smart that they called him the Buddha. And now these barbarians who have, we have to admit, learned how to read and write in a strange way, are coming back to us with text which purport to be something brand new, but maybe it isn't brand new at all. It's just our Chinese culture being returned to us. So this is what the Buddhists were up against with their canon and the construction of it. They were up against this very fierce and developed cultural environment. Now, in the 4th century, Buddhism has now been in China for over 2 centuries. China began to train its own monks. That was a big step. At first, they were totally dependent on missionaries coming from Parthia, from the Kushans. This is similar to any religion that's missionary. When it first arrives, there's nobody who's in the place, usually, who can take over and be a teacher or become a leader. They have to depend on the missionaries. So the Buddhists were pretty much like this. They were dependent upon missionaries. But as the canon began to expand, that is, over the centuries from the first translation bureau to the time of Daoan, many Buddhist texts had been translated into Chinese. And Chinese began to read them. And some of them were converted. And some of them became monks. And one of the most famous was Daoan. Daoan was special in a lot of ways. He said about the canon, it can't be that we have to understand Buddhism through our own former ancient literature in China. It has its own history. It is the word of the Buddha. And so Daoan set about to find as many translations as he possibly could. He tried to make a catalog of all the translations that existed. He was trying to determine what is the nature of Indian Buddhism, not as some sort of copy of ancient Chinese, but a unique and different tradition with its own literature. So Buddhism is coming of age with Daoan. Here is a native Chinese person who is really seeing Buddhism as a legitimate development on its own as Indic, and yet of such importance that he has become converted to it and wants to make sure that all of the translations that have been made of it are correct. He begins to worry. Are we sure that our translation method is making a canon in Chinese that is accurate? And Daoan said, there are a lot of these Sanskrit words. We have no equivalence. There's no possible way. We have no equivalent for the word Buddha. We've never had a Buddha. We have to borrow the words. But we have to understand when we borrow the words, we are also borrowing the entire cultural pattern which has created these words. And we should not assume that just because it's in Chinese characters, it is suddenly transformed into Chinese culture. So Daoan goes looking for some really important monks to come to China and to help him with this task, to continue the translation of the canon text, but to also be sure that the translation of those canon texts is true to their Indic origin. he heard of a very famous monk from Kucha in Central Asia by the name of Kumarajiva. And he encouraged the royal house to try to get this person into China, and let's make use of him because he knows what Buddhism is all about. He knows what Indian Buddhism is about. He speaks and knows Sanskrit. So Kumarajiva came to Chang'an. We're told part of the lore is that the emperor saw that he was this really special person. His use of language and his knowledge in the Buddhist realm was such that he said, we must give him many wives so he can have many children so that his children can become the translators of the future. We never hear of any of Kumarajiva's children. Genetically, it's hard to pass on traits that are perfected in an individual. The Chinese had to find that out. Kumarajiva was a bit taken aback by a lot of things that he found in China. And he realized that the Chinese had a very limited understanding still of the complexity of Buddhism as it had developed in Central Asia and in India itself. The Chinese Buddhists assumed that every Buddhist document was equal to every other Buddhist document. And Kumarajiva, of course, in his sophisticated background, knew that there were divisions within Buddhism. There were streams of thought, then arguments and debates, and that the Chinese knew hardly any of this. So the first thing he set about was to say to them, there is a superior kind of text. If you're going to make a canon, then the superior text is Mahayana. But if you want to understand Mahayana, you have to understand the other kind of text, which could be called Hinayana, but if you don't have this other kind of text, it's a little hard to understand Mahayana. In fact, it's probably impossible. And so poor Kumarajiva, he not only had to translate his Mahayana text, but he had to translate the earlier material. He had to translate the non-Mahayana texts like Abhidharma, these erudite commentaries, so that the Chinese would understand the great divergence within Buddhism and the great complexities. So he became a key person in giving China the Buddhist canonic material and allowing them to understand it and to begin to catalog it. In that way, extending the work of Daoan. There was another monk who came to Chang'an, Buddhabhadra. And he started teaching meditation. I talked to you about Ansgar Gal, one of the Parthians who came and started the Translation Bureau. And Ansgar Gal's works were primarily meditation texts. That is, that they believed if China is going to have texts which will allow them to become Buddhist, they need to be taught how to meditate. But when Buddhabhadra came, he came by sea. And when he came to Chang'an, he said, Kumarajiva has no meditation heritage, but I do. And so he began to teach a form of Buddhist meditation, which seemed to be seen as opponent to Kumarajiva. Well, the emperor became very concerned about this big split that was developing already within the Buddhist Sangha. And so Buddhabhadra was kicked out of the capital. And Kumarajiva was declared by the emperor to be the one who had the orthodox Buddhist tradition. But of course, what this represented was that China was already beginning to feel that there were very great variations in Buddhist texts, which represented the schools and development of Buddhism that they had known nothing of before. Now we have a very famous document. It's Taisho 1509, that is the Taisho Buddhist Canon, the Dajia Dulun. And it's a commentary. And I believe that it is important for us to look at that text because it tells us a great deal about how the canon was being formed in the translation. I've always been persuaded that Professor Jopo Khan, who did his dissertation at the University of Chicago, and who said, if you look at this text, it's divided into 3 segments. As you read, first, you will have a passage, which is, you can see up above, the sutra passage. And following that, you'll have a question. And following the question, you have an answer. So this is unlike anything ever written in India. So the question is, what's going on in this text? What are we seeing when we look at a text which does this with the canonic material? Well, one way to look at it is to say that this is a basic note-taking of the process of translating text into Chinese. And that in Chang'an, people had these Sanskrit texts which were coming, and as they came, they looked at them and they had a committee. All translation was done by a committee. They had the most learned monks available sitting around a table. the monk who had brought a text or who memorized it would say a sentence from the text that was being translated. In this case, the sentence was, "Thus have I heard at a time when," etc. So then the learned monks would listen to this and say, the question, why would you have this statement at the beginning of every sutra? They are asking this translator, this monk who's bringing in the text, why is that? And the question is, who were the questioners? It appears, if we look at it as a record of the translation process, the questioners were the Chinese monks assembled around the table, trying to help the translator put it into good Chinese. And in order to do that, they had to ask a lot of questions. So then the translator who's working with this has to answer them. So who is the answerer in the case of this famous text? And Professor Zhou has said, it's Kumarajiva. This is the record, he believes, of what happened when Kumarajiva came to Chang'an, and he brought with him Mahayana's text in particular. And as they were being translated, this is what went on. That we really have an incredible document which may tell us precisely how the canon translations were being made and what were the questions being asked and how did Kumarajiva respond to those questions in order to help them understand how to render a particular expression into Chinese. So the text that they were working with that is the Panchavimshati, which means the perfect wisdom in 25,000 lines. It has been translated into English by Edward Conze, and it became a very key part of the Chinese Buddhist canon in its early development. So if you want to see what Kumarajiva had brought with him, it's something close to what the Sanskrit was that Edward Conze used. And we believe that now what they are trying to do is to make a Chinese translation which is accurate, and a Chinese translation which is based on the idea that this thought is purely Indic. It belongs to the Buddha only, and that we must not degrade it by making it as if it was simply a reflection of the thought of Lao Tzu or Mengzi or any of the other Tao teachers or Confucian teachers. So the questions were being raised by these learned monks who had come and were asked to join in the process, and they were allowed to challenge. Now, some people say that this text was a translation from a Sanskrit original. And that's true for the sutra portion of it. But when you come to the question and the answers, many of them simply cannot be Indic, because you have a question often in Sanskrit, this word means, but in Chinese, our characters for it mean. So the idea that came and is still being debated, I don't agree with it, but is that was it written, a written text coming from India in its complete form, and that the questions and the answers were all done in India. And some people said it was done by the most famous of the Mahayana teachers, Nagarjuna. But it is hard to maintain that. I prefer to think that we have here a gathering of monks with a missionary, and they're trying their best to create the most perfect and complete and honest translation of the Indic material. So if Professor Zhou is right, then Kumarajiva is the one who's responding to these monks. This is not a text that's written in India. It's the notation that somebody sat down and took dictation in China, and as the canon itself is being produced. And that it was done by one of the most famous of the teachers. Now, a very strong argument in favor of this position is the answers. Where do we find such answers in the Buddhist tradition? And the answer is, we find them in the Sarvastivada tradition. We can see many times where the statements made in the answer in the Dajjadulun can be traced directly to the Sarvastivada, which was an Indian school that said all things exist in time, the past, the present, and the future. Well, it so happens that we know from the biographies that Kumarajiva had been brought up as a Sarvastivadin, and that he later converted to Mahayana. But he would never have left behind all of his training, which was Sarvastivada. So this is one theory on how the canon was being constructed in China, and who was doing it, and how were they doing it. So then the question is, who was writing it down? If it wasn't written by Nagarjuna, who was in 2nd or 3rd century in India, then the person that we think is most probable to have been able to do this was Seng Rui. He was a contemporary of Kumarajiva. He was one of his students. He was helping with translations, and that he was practicing Buddhism. We know from one of work attributed to him where he was talking about how to sit in meditation. So Kumarajiva's pupil, Sung Rui, would be a pretty good candidate for the one who actually wrote this all down, who was present in the room when the translations were being made, and who recorded the questions and the answers of his teacher, Kumarajiva. That's at least a possibility. After Kumarajiva's work, then and after this second wave of translation, which was to make things like translations that were very close to the original Sanskrit as possible, a school of thought, a group of monks who chose 3 of the texts of Mahayana and used them to say, if we look at these 3 texts, we can understand at least the Mahayana form of Buddhism. So what began to happen in China is that schools of thought were developing about the nature of the canon. And people were making choices about which canonic text to use so that we can see these trends beginning to develop over time. That is, the first translations trying somehow to make it understandable within the Chinese tradition. The second level, which said, no, we ought to be able to have this so that it represents truly the Indian form of Buddhism. And then if that's so, we now have several hundred texts. Which ones should we study? Which ones should we put our attention on? We can't really read them all. And we don't have access to them. Remember, it was very hard to get access to a text. Somebody had to copy it out by hand. Very expensive process. So you were really lucky to even have 1 page of a text which was in your own possession. And so this is a way of trying to handle the canon, to make decisions about which of the texts should be really used. And so the Sanlun School was one way to do this. Another group chose a text, the Satya Siddhi. And this was a text attributed to an Indian teacher, Hari Varman, and it had come along with Kumarajiva into China. And it taught a form of Buddhism which was not just Mahayana. It was the truth, the glory of the truth of the Buddhist teaching. And it was, many people looked at it and said, what Kumarajiva was telling us, this great leader, is to become Mahayana. And this text says, well, you can hang on to all the old forms as well. So the Chinese are now beginning to break up. The Sangha is not so homogeneous anymore. When you start choosing which text you're going to study, each text has its own history. And so the people who were following Buddhism had now come to a place where it was a more sophisticated understanding. They were looking at Buddhism as purely Indic, and they were making choices among all the translations that were becoming available to them. And the schools of Buddhism were now going to develop, that is, schools in which monks had made choices about which one of the texts was the most important. And that would dominate and still has an effect in Chinese Buddhism. The use of the canon as texts which are chosen because they're so special. So this is a look at the second wave of translations. That the canon itself has to respond to the fact that Buddhism is now becoming a Chinese movement, that there are Chinese monks. And by the 6th century, there are Chinese nuns. And that there are hundreds of texts available in a form which is considered to be authentic. So that Buddhism and the canon are developing and maturing within the Chinese environment. And it's taking centuries for this to happen. Buddhism didn't just walk into China and find them millions of people ready to give them support and to become followers. It was a long and very tortuous path sometimes. So in order to understand Chinese Buddhism, we have to understand how their canon was made. Thank you very much. I will see you for lecture 3 shortly. Thank you.